We keep on our discussion on macroeconomics. In this class, we have two topics to share with you. The first one is economic policy, and the second one is the economic theories. First, let's discuss about the economic policy. Governments in general have two main ways of affecting the economy. First, it has the fiscal policy to affect the economy in terms by taxation and spending, the expenditure it plans to invest or spend in the economy. And another way to affect the economy by the government is called the monetary policy. Monetary policy refers to management of money supply in the economy. So it has two ways to influence or affect the economy by the government. Let's start to discuss the fiscal policy. There are two main elements that governments must plan for each year. First, the income. Income is primarily the money the government raises from direct and indirect taxes from individuals or businesses. That means the revenue received or the income received by governments are mainly from taxes, like salary tax from individuals and profit tax from the businesses. There are other income or types of income, such as the government services. There's income from selling the government services to the public. Also, the government can sell the properties to the public, like selling the lands or any other properties that government owned that can raise funds for the government expenditure. And next is government expenditure. It has to plan the expenditure to be incurred in a particular fiscal year. It's the total amount the government will need to spend to provide services for the population. Some basic or fundamental services or utility services the government provides to the population. One example is like the immigration department. The government issued a passport and other types of passport-related services to the public, and also like the police, fire services. All those services are funded or financed by the government. That's the expenditure the government needs to do or to pay for it. In the medium term or long term, that means say 10 years time, most governments would prefer to run a balanced budget. That means the government income and expenditure are exactly matched. So in the long run, any government in the world has the objective or the aim to run a balanced budget. No matter the income or expenditure, they are more or less the same, so they can match with each other. However, governments may decide to run budget deficit or a budget surplus with several reasons. And here are the reasons for budget deficit. What is budget deficit? Budget deficit occurs when government spending is higher than government income. That means it spends more than it received from the public. So why does the government need to run a budget deficit? It is often to see the budget deficit when a deflationary gap. So deflationary gap means the level of aggregate demand of the economy is insufficient to lead to full employment. Government has its own objective. For example, full employment, stable prices, or stable inflation, stable balance of payment, that all government objectives or government policy objectives that we discussed before, and once, say, one element, full employment, cannot be achieved, the government needs to decide whether it should step in by running budget deficit to improve the overall aggregate demand of the economy so that the full employment status can be achieved by spending more from the government. And on the other hand, if the aggregate demand in the economy is very strong, then we can see the government will run budget surplus. That means government spending is lower than government income. It can raise more taxes, no matter from the individuals or businesses, or the government would reduce the expenditure by itself. It is often used when an inflationary gap exists in the economy. That means when the economy is very hot, pricing or the inflation occurs in the economy, the government needs to do, from the budget point of view, to cut its spending and to raise more income or taxes from the public or the population. So as said, it occurs when aggregate demand in the economy is higher than the country can supply, leading to high inflation. So we have the budget deficit and budget surplus, and the government can choose what type of tools under the fiscal policy to adjust the economy, or to adjust the economy that can achieve its own policy objectives. So let's summarize. The economic policy, the government can do either budget deficit or budget surplus under the economic policy in order to achieve the policy objectives. For budget deficit, the government is injecting more money into the economy than it is taking out. That means the government expenditure increases, which is higher than the income generated from the population to the government treasury department, and it helps to boost the aggregate demand and reduce unemployment. Because the government expenditure increases, so when we use the so-called aggregate demand equation to measure the GDP, the gross domestic product, the overall GDP, it will be increased, and it helps to reduce unemployment by increasing more people going back to the job market. So it is known as expansionary strategy. On the other hand, the budget surplus, the government is taking money out of the economy. It reduces aggregate demand. The government expenditure reduced it, and the government increases taxes or other kind of income from its services to the public. So it is a contractionary policy instead of expansionary. After fiscal policy, let's discuss about monetary policy. Monetary policy involves the changing of interest rates or varying the amount of money that banks need to keep in reserve. So it involves two types of things. First is about the interest rates, and the second thing is the amount of money or the money supply. It assumes that the monetary policy is also controlled by the central bank. So the central bank is under the government. It can change the economic activity by changing the interest rates or varying of the amount of money that banks need to keep in reserves. Here is one key point that I would like to address here is about the bank's needs to keep reserve. Under the banking system, there's a requirement for bank to keep a minimum reserve. And here is an example how the multiply effect under the banking reserve system and how does it affect the economy. Suppose there is a bank, what we call bank A, and a depositor deposit the money into the bank. And the bank is required under the law to keep at least 10% out of this $100 as a reserve. So in other words, it has to keep minimum $10 in its safe as a reserve, and it can lend out $90 from this $100 deposit received from the customer. So it lent out 90%, say $90 to the economy. At the end of the day, anyone got this $90, they consume, they spend, and this $90 finally come to another bank. So that means going back to the banking system. And then the new cycle begins again. New cycle means the bank received this $90, it has to keep minimum 10% as a reserve, and it can lend out 90% of this $90. And under this system, we can see the bank number one initially has $100 deposit, so the total money supply here is $100. After keeping $10 reserve, and it lends out $90. And the $90 right now is passing to bank number two. And bank number two keep 10% of $90 as a reserve, and it can lend out $81 to the population or the public. So the money supply right now is $100 here from in the bank one deposit amount plus $90, the deposit amount under bank number two. So under this arrangement, if there's a 10 bank here, at the end of the day, the money supply after 10 cycles, the money supply is changed from $100 to more than $650 to the economy. So here is what is the reserve system running and how is the multiplier effect affects the money supply. So you got the basic concept. A monetary policy can be described as expansionary or contractionary. In our example, just shown how the money kept as a reserve in the bank and how it lent out to the population, you have a basic ideas of how to manipulate the money supply by changing the reserve ratio or the government required reserve ratio in the interest rates. Under expansionary policy or expansionary monetary policy, increases in money supply in the economy, it helps to increase investment and employment. In other words, if the government would like to boost the economy to full employment because of, say, the economy generally is not good, it can increase its money supply in the economy by changing the minimum required reserve ratio in the bank. So the bank no needs to keep as much as money than before. It can lend out more money to any parties that would like to invest or employ people or even consume. It helps to increase the overall aggregate demand. On the other hand, under contractionary policy, the government decreases the total money supply, and it helps to reduce the demand and easing inflation. Contractionary policy is generally seen under the high inflation economy because the people would like to buy goods with a much higher prices than before. It's probably the money is quite easy to borrow from the bank, then the governments need to increase the minimum reserve requirement ratio, that the bank has to keep more money as a reserve and less money can be lent out. It helps to reduce the overall money supply in the economy, that can reduce the demand and easing inflation. Under our discussion, you can see we have three different types of monetary policy tools. First, interest rates. Raising interest rates will increase the cost of borrowing money for individuals and businesses. And the outcome is to reduce the level of investment by businesses and expenditure by individuals. That means the aggregate demand reduced. So raising interest rates means that the economy is quite hot. High inflation maybe. And once the interest rates increased, it increased the cost of borrowing for both individuals and businesses. And the outcome is it hopes to reduce the demand for goods, services in the market. It helps to reduce the price level and the inflation. And reserve. The government can adjust the requirements for reserve kept in the bank. Increasing the reserve requirements will reduce the amount of money that banks have available to lend and limiting money supply. It also tends to push interest rates up because less money supply in the market, so you have to pay higher interest rate if you need the money to support your businesses or your own consumption. The third monetary policy tool is open market operations. If you remember, we have the fiscal policy, we have the budget deficit, and we have the budget surplus. If the government is running budget deficit, some governments need to borrow money. When it borrows money, that means it has to issue bonds to the public to raise funds to finance the government expenditure. So the government can buy or sell its own bonds, that it is able to exert some control over money supply. If it buys back bonds, it will release cash back into circulation. That means the government direct inject the cash in the economy if it buys back its own bonds. On the other hand, if it sells more bonds to the market through these open market operations, the government right now is capturing more money back from the economy back into the government system. So it is a contractionary monetary policy when the government by selling more bonds to the market because it captures more money back from the market. So next, we will discuss about the economics theories. We have three types of economics theory that we would like to discuss with you. First, the classical theory. Next, the Keynesian view or the demand side economics. Third, the monetarist view or the supply side economics. Let's start discussing on classical theory. The classical theory suggests that government does nothing. That means the government no need to do anything to adjust the economy in order to go back or to achieve the government objective. The reason behind is those classical economists believe that the economy would naturally move to an equilibrium point with full employment all by itself. So those classical economists, they are the free market believer. They trust the market has a mechanism for both demand and supply, going back to the equilibrium without any government intervention. If the government's policy objective is to have full employment, government no need to take care of anything, because the market itself can move to the equilibrium point. But the classical theory is not practical, especially in Great Depression. Great Depression happened in the United States during 1930s. The wages, the wages level decreased a lot. That means a lot of people unemployed, oversupply of labor, the wages or the salary level just down by a lot as compared to 1929 or 1928. So in early 1930s, a lot of unemployment and the wages going down a lot. However, even with such adjustments in the wages and salaries, we cannot see increasing in the employment in the United States. So the classical theory cannot explain why it happens, because you cannot see it happen to go back to full employment, even though the wages or the salaries go down a lot or went down a lot. So then move to Keynesian view or the demand side. For Keynesian view or demand side economics, it was developed by John Maynard Keynes, and Keynes argued that the government needs to manipulate the level of aggregate demand within the economy, or sometimes what we call demand side economics. Remember, we have the equation that is C, consumption, plus investments, that is I, and plus G. G is the government expenditure, and plus the gap between export and import, so here is the equation for aggregate demand. And when the government spend more through increasing the government spending, it helps to improve the aggregate demand within the economy. It is the theory proposed by John Maynard Keynes. And he argued that the government intervention was often needed in order to move the economy closer to its ideal equilibrium point. So the economists think the full employment is very important, so they suggest the government need to step into the market to move back the economy closer to the equilibrium point of view. In practice, this means that government should borrow money and inject it into the economy, or what we mentioned in fiscal policy, that the government needs to run a budget deficit when the economic growth needs to be stimulated. And government should increase taxes and run budget surplus to slow the economy if it was growing too fast and experiencing significant inflation. So here is the concept behind Keynesian economics, or they call supply side economics. The final theory that we would like to discuss is monetarist view, or the supply side. Supply side economists, they go back to the classical view. So they returned to the classical view that there was only one equilibrium point in an economy, the point where supply equals demand in all markets in the economy. But in reality, we observed there's no equilibrium, because like what happened in Great Depression, proposed by Keynesians. Okay, the government should step in, and government intervention can help to solve the problem of employment. And the only reason that the economy does not find this equilibrium proposed by these supply-side economists is because it will be hindered by market imperfections. So they are not saying the classical view is wrong for those supply-side economists. They think whether there's any market imperfections or obstacles in the economy that cannot let the price mechanism working well, so there's still low employment, cannot go back to full employment. And examples of market imperfections are: first, inflation; second, government spending and taxation; and then it's price fixing, minimum wage legislation, and regulation of markets, and also abuses of monopoly power. So monetarist view, why the economy cannot go back to equilibrium because of these 6 market imperfections, or the examples of those 6 market imperfections. And the role of the government is therefore to remove these imperfections, allowing the economy to naturally find its ideal equilibrium. So the solutions proposed by them to economic problems are often described as supply-side economics. They are focused on improving the supply of factors of production in the economy. It's not the same as Keynes or Keynesian view is on stimulating the aggregate demand by government intervention. But for monetarist view, they focus on how to improve the supply of factors. So once the market imperfections are gone, then the equilibrium status can be found and full employment can be achieved. So in class question time, we have 2 questions for you to think about and to have an understanding of the topic that we discussed. First, which of the following statements is not consistent with supply-side policies? A. Reduction in unemployment benefit. B. Running a budget surplus. C. Improvements to job centers. And D. Reducing the power of unions. And in our discussion on supply-side economics, or the monetary view, the monetarist view is suggesting government should remove the market imperfections and allowing the economy to naturally find its ideal equilibrium. So there's 4 options here. Only one option is not consistent with supply-side policies. So it's quite straightforward. And another question is, which one of the following would cause a fall in the level of aggregate demand in an economy? A. A decrease in the level of imports. B. A fall in the amount people choose to save. C. A decrease in government expenditure. And D. A decrease in the level of income tax. And remember, we have this aggregate demand equation. It measures the GDP of an economy. So which option, A, B, C, or D, is not consistent with others on the aggregate demand in an economy?